Very few athletes in the history of bodybuilding can say they actually defeated Arnold Schwarzenegger in official competitions. We're talking about a name that became almost synonymous with the Mr. Olympia title, an athlete who dominated the sport for years and completely redefined what it meant to be a champion. That's why, whenever someone did manage to beat him, the impact was so massive that it echoed across decades and still sparks heated debates among fans and experts to this day. Among all those rare names, one stands above the rest. Sergio Oliva didn't just beat Arnold, he did it on the biggest stage in bodybuilding, the Mr. Olympia. And it wasn't a close call or a controversial decision at the time. It was such a dominant performance that everyone in attendance knew they were witnessing something the sport had never seen before. The year was 1969, and the shockwaves from that competition were historic. By the way, we've got a great video here on the channel breaking down that Mr. Olympia. That year, Arnold arrived as the Great Promise, the young phenomenon who seemed destined to rule the Olympia for many years to come. But that night, he ran into someone who was simply on another level. Sergio Oliva didn't win just because of size, but because of an insane combination of mass, proportions, and stage presence. And today, we're talking about this true colossus of bodybuilding. So drop a like and come along with us. Sergio Oliva was born in 1941 in Cuba during a time marked by political instability and intense social tension under the regime of Fulgencio Batista. No one could have imagined that, in such a turbulent environment, a man would emerge who was destined to change the history of bodybuilding forever. From a very young age, Sergio already stood out for his unusual physical strength. Even as a teenager, he showed levels of power and endurance far beyond what you'd expect from someone with no structured training. It wasn't just raw strength, it was a natural ease with intense physical effort. Everyone around him noticed, and the same question kept coming up: where did all of this come from? The turning point came in a completely unexpected way. Living a simple life, Sergio received an invitation to try Olympic weightlifting. With no refined technique, no specific preparation, and barely understanding the sport, he accepted the challenge. What happened next left even experienced coaches absolutely stunned. In his very first tests, despite lacking proper form, Sergio was lifting weights that trained athletes often take years to reach. The strength was there, pure, raw, almost instinctive. It quickly became clear that this wasn't an ordinary talent, but someone with extremely rare potential, capable of redefining physical standards. Not long after, Sergio Oliva was already part of the Cuban national weightlifting team. His development was incredibly fast, driven by exceptional genetics and an almost unreal ability to adapt to heavy training. Sergio Oliva's progress in Olympic weightlifting was so rapid it seemed unreal. In a short period of time, he went from total improvisation to a level that placed him among the strongest athletes in the country. What usually takes years of technical and progressive training, Sergio achieved in just a matter of months, leaving coaches and teammates in complete disbelief. Early in his training, his lifts were already surpassing 300 pounds, about 136 kilograms. For an athlete still developing, with limited technical refinement and little competitive experience, those numbers were simply absurd. Within just a few months, Sergio reached a milestone that set him apart from everyone else: a combined total of 1,000 pounds, roughly 453 kilograms, across the main Olympic lifts. Performances like that were rare, even among seasoned veterans, instantly placing Sergio in a league of his own within the Cuban team. Realizing they were dealing with a once-in-a-generation talent, the team's leadership invested heavily in advanced training. Sergio went through a period of technical refinement outside of Cuba, where he sharpened movements like the snatch and the clean and jerk. This remarkable progress cemented Sergio Oliva as one of the most promising athletes in Cuban Olympic weightlifting. In 1962, Sergio Oliva traveled to Jamaica to represent Cuba at the Central American and Caribbean Games. Inside the arena, he did exactly what was expected of an elite athlete, competing at a high level and earning a silver medal. But, ironically, the most important moment of that trip wouldn't happen on the platform or under the bright lights of competition. Away from the public eye, Sergio was carrying a decision that had been quietly taking shape for a long time. He knew that returning to Cuba meant staying trapped under a regime that limited his freedom and his future. The real battle he was facing wasn't against other athletes, but against the system controlled by Fidel Castro. Defection was anything but simple. Sergio waited for the right moment, calculated every move, and when the opportunity appeared, he acted. He slipped past surveillance, ran past armed guards, and sprinted through the streets of Kingston toward the U.S. consulate. Every second of that escape could mean capture or freedom. The danger was real and immediate. Cuban agents were on alert, and a single mistake could cost him not just his career, but his life. Even so, Sergio didn't hesitate. When he reached the consulate and requested political asylum, he crossed a point of no return, permanently severing his ties with the Cuban regime. From that moment on, Sergio Oliva's life changed forever. He left behind his homeland, his teammates, and everything he had ever known to embrace a future filled with uncertainty in the United States. When Sergio arrived in the U.S., he landed in Miami, like many other Cuban refugees of that era. Reality was far from the glamour that awaited him years later. To survive, he took on simple, low-paying jobs, including repairing televisions, while trying to adjust to a new country, a new language, and a completely unfamiliar culture. Even facing financial and emotional hardship, Sergio never stopped training. Whenever he could, he found time to lift weights, keeping alive the fire of a sport that had already become part of who he was. Conditions didn't matter. Limited resources didn't matter. Discipline and sheer willpower always came first. Throughout the 1960s, the Cuban community in the United States was growing rapidly, especially in Florida. Miami was becoming a major hub for immigrants trying to rebuild their lives far from the communist regime. But for Sergio, that closeness also came with risks and limitations, both personal and professional. That's when he made a bold and strategic decision to leave Florida. Following advice from people close to him and searching for greater security, Sergio chose to distance himself from the main centers of Cuban immigration. It was a move that showed he wasn't just thinking about the present, but about building something long-term. In 1963, Sergio moved to Chicago. Chicago placed Sergio Oliva into a routine that very few people could endure. During the day, he worked in a steel mill, dealing with extreme heat, constant physical strain, and long hours of brutal labor. After his shift ended, when his body was already exhausted, he went straight to the gym. His workouts came after punishing workdays, with no excuses and no shortcuts. While others looked for rest or comfort, Sergio pushed his body past its limits, turning exhaustion into fuel for progress. It was also in Chicago that he joined the city's police department, a career he would maintain for 25 years. Balancing life as a police officer with intense training demanded absolute discipline and a near superhuman mindset. During this time, he began training at legendary gyms within the local strength scene, true iron temples where some of the most respected athletes in the country gathered. Among them were names like Bob Guida and, for a short period, a young Arnold Schwarzenegger. In 1963, Sergio Oliva made a decision that would permanently change the direction of his career. He walked away from Olympic weightlifting and shifted his full focus to bodybuilding. The strength was already there, but now the challenge was different, turning raw power into aesthetics, proportions, and pure visual impact on stage. The transition was immediate and explosive. In his very first bodybuilding competition, the Mr. Chicago, Sergio took first place. For someone just entering a new sport, that victory sent a clear message. This wasn't just a strong athlete trying to adapt. This was someone born to dominate. The following year, he proved the result was no fluke. Sergio won the Mr. Illinois, locking in his name on the regional bodybuilding scene. His early appearances at the Mr. America, however, brought frustration. Even though he was often recognized as the most muscular competitor on stage, Sergio didn't take home the overall title. Time and time again, he walked away with the most muscular award, but without the main win, a situation that immediately raised questions. Over time, frustration turned into open indignation. Sergio began to publicly question the sport's subjective judging criteria, arguing that factors beyond the physique, such as nationality, language, and racial bias, were influencing the results. The major turning point in Sergio Oliva's career came when the bodybuilding landscape went through a historic shift. Fed up with subjective standards and political decisions, Joe Weider and Ben Weider created a new contest, the Mr. Olympia. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Only the best physique on stage would win. Unlike the traditional competitions of that era, the Mr. Olympia didn't judge personality, secondary athletic skills, or national background. Size, symmetry, proportion, and visual impact ruled above everything else. For someone like Sergio, who firmly believed the physique should speak for itself, this new stage felt tailor-made. In this fairer environment, Sergio finally found the space to show everything he was capable of. Competing under the International Federation of Bodybuilding, he began stacking major victories, including prestigious titles at the Mr. World and Mr. Universe. Each win reinforced the feeling that the system was finally recognizing his true value. In 1966, Sergio made his first appearance at the Mr. Olympia. While he wasn't yet the undisputed star of the show, his presence was impossible to ignore. His size, structure, and sheer visual power made it clear he wasn't there just to compete. He was there to learn, evolve, and come back even more dangerous. That first Olympia experience was a setup for something much bigger. Sergio left the 1966 contest with absolute certainty. He had found the right stage. The year 1967 marked the beginning of Sergio Oliva's absolute peak. On the Mr. Olympia stage, he didn't just win, he dominated. His physique was bigger, wider, and more impactful than anyone else's that night. There was no doubt, no debate, and no room for interpretation. Sergio had become the best bodybuilder in the world. In 1968, the situation was even more symbolic. Sergio stepped on stage with virtually no real challengers. He was the only competitor at the Olympia that year, an extremely rare moment in the sport's history. The win was uncontested, and while it lacked the drama of direct competition, it reinforced an uncomfortable truth for bodybuilding at the time. No one could come close to what he brought to the stage. It was during this period that the legend truly took shape. Sergio Oliva's physique seemed to defy human logic. Massive, ultra-wide shoulders, a razor-thin waist, gigantic arms, and a torso that looked permanently expanded. It wasn't just muscle, it was presence, impact, and pure visual intimidation. The nickname, the myth, stopped being an exaggeration and became a definition. In 1969, everything changed. That year's Olympia promised a historic showdown. On the other side of the stage stood Arnold Schwarzenegger, the young phenomenon many believed was ready to dethrone the champion. Expectations were sky-high, and the atmosphere backstage was thick with tension. That's where Sergio proved the battle wasn't just physical, it was mental too. Backstage, he hid his body under a large coat, preventing the other competitors, especially Arnold, from seeing his true condition. When he finally revealed his physique on stage, the shock was immediate. The victory was unanimous and historic. Sergio Oliva didn't just beat Arnold Schwarzenegger. He permanently cemented his place as one of the greatest legends bodybuilding has ever known. The year 1970 marked a sudden shift in bodybuilding history. On the Mr. Olympia stage, Arnold Schwarzenegger claimed his first title, kicking off what many would later call a new era. To the public, it looked like the natural rise of a new king. For Sergio Oliva, that result meant something far more complex and far more painful. Unhappy with finishing second, Sergio didn't accept the loss in silence. He openly accused political interference and backstage favoritism. According to Oliva, the result wasn't based solely on what was presented on stage, but on clear interest from the organization to push a new star to lead the sport. His public statements were harsh and filled with frustration. Sergio directly accused the International Federation of Bodybuilding and the Weider brothers of manipulating decisions to favor Arnold. Those comments created a heavy atmosphere within bodybuilding, exposing the political side of the sport, something many fans preferred not to see. Regardless of who was right, one thing was undeniable: bodybuilding was changing. Arnold's victory in 1970 symbolized a changing of the guard. As Arnold began his absolute dominance throughout the 1970s, Sergio started to feel the weight of that transition. Little by little, he was pushed to the margins of the main circuit, not because of his physique, but due to political conflicts and resistance to the new system. After the 1970 loss, Sergio Oliva's position within the main circuit began to deteriorate quickly. At the Mr. Universe, the results once again became controversial, reigniting old suspicions. For many observers, Sergio still brought a superior physique, yet once again left the stage without the win, only intensifying the tension surrounding him. This time, however, Sergio wasn't alone. One of the most influential voices in the world of strength training, Arthur Jones, publicly came to his defense. Jones stated that Sergio was clearly being hurt by political decisions, not by technical judging. The situation reached a breaking point in 1971 when Sergio was officially banned from competing at the Mr. Olympia. The official reason was his participation in a rival event, which allegedly violated IFBB rules. To many fans, it felt like a conveniently timed punishment at a critical moment. What made the situation even stranger was the fact that Sergio was allowed to attend the Olympia only as a guest. He was there, but not allowed to compete. Seeing a former champion off the stage while others fought for the title only deepened the sense of injustice and made it clear that something was seriously wrong behind the scenes. The final showdown between Sergio Oliva and Arnold Schwarzenegger took place in 1972, once again surrounded by controversy. Once again, Sergio walked away defeated and deeply dissatisfied with the conditions of the competition. Tired of political battles, rule changes, and what he saw as targeted persecution, he made a definitive decision to leave the IFBB. From that point on, the myth would follow a new path, outside the system that had helped make him famous. Outside the IFBB, Sergio Oliva found a new place to compete by joining the World Bodybuilding Guild, the WBBG. The federation aimed to establish itself as a real alternative to the Weider-controlled system and needed a big name to gain credibility. Sergio, in turn, needed a stage where he could compete without the political chains that had frustrated him for so long. In this new environment, he quickly became the organization's biggest star. His physique was still breathtaking, and the experience he had built over the years made him almost unbeatable within the WBBG. Fans who followed these competitions saw the same myth who had dominated the Olympia just a few years earlier. The wins came one after another. Sergio captured multiple Mr. Olympus titles, solidifying himself as the top name in the federation. Beyond the WBBG, Sergio also earned major victories in the World Amateur Bodybuilding Association, the WABA. Even outside the most famous circuit, he kept winning, proving that his greatness didn't depend solely on the Mr. Olympia stage, but on who he was as an athlete. Despite all that, something irreversible was beginning to change. Even while stacking titles, Sergio started losing media attention. At the same time, Arnold Schwarzenegger was dominating the global narrative with the release of Pumping Iron. Bodybuilding was officially entering pop culture, and while Sergio was still winning, the spotlight had clearly shifted elsewhere. After more than a decade away from bodybuilding's biggest stage, Sergio Oliva decided to make a bold comeback. In 1984, 12 years after his last Mr. Olympia appearance, he returned to compete in a world completely different from the one he had ruled in the 1960s. The sport had changed, the judging standards had changed, and the type of body rewarded on stage was no longer the same. In this new era, the focus was extreme definition, deep cuts, and an almost bone-dry level of conditioning. To adapt, Sergio was forced to drastically change his approach. He tried to follow a strategy that worked for other athletes at the time, adopting Frank Zane's diet, famous for producing a refined, aesthetic look with very low body fat. The problem was that what worked for Zane didn't work for Sergio. By following that diet, Oliva lost the very thing that had always been his greatest weapon, massive muscle volume. On stage, he no longer displayed the colossal physique that had once intimidated everyone around him, and that was obvious to both the judges and the crowd. The result was tough to swallow. Sergio finished the 1984 Mr. Olympia in 8th place. The following year, in 1985, the same thing happened, 8th place again. For someone who had been a 3-time champion and a true symbol of the sport, it felt almost cruel, a reminder that time and trends spare no one, not even legends. Ironically, those results earned Sergio the nickname, the 8th wonder of the world. A title filled with humor, but also a quiet sense of sadness. Even after the disappointing outcomes of the previous years, Sergio Oliva still hadn't given up. He was preparing to compete again in 1986, believing he could still fine-tune a few details and end his career on a more dignified note. At 45 years old, his body was no longer the same, but his competitive mindset remained intact, driven by pride and the desire to prove he still had something left. Then, a tragic episode changed everything forever. During a domestic conflict, an argument spiraled completely out of control and ended in a shooting inside his own home. Sergio was hit by 5 gunshots fired by his wife, an event so shocking that it quickly spread through the media and deeply shook the bodybuilding world. Despite how severe it was, Sergio survived. Even while wounded, he managed to reach the hospital and underwent surgeries that saved his life. But from the very beginning, it was clear that something irreversible had happened. The physical and emotional damage was simply too great for any competitive return. The details of the case were never fully clarified. There were conflicting accounts, contradictory reports, and many unanswered questions. What everyone knew was that this moment marked an abrupt end to a career that had already seen glory, controversy, and reinvention. From that point on, Sergio Oliva would never step on a competitive stage again. His bodybuilding journey didn't end with a planned retirement or a final defeat, but with a cruel and unpredictable event. Away from the stage and the spotlight, Sergio Oliva built a life defined by hard work and discipline. For decades, he served as a police officer in Chicago, balancing the demanding routine of law enforcement with the respect he had already earned in the bodybuilding world. Among co-workers and close friends, Sergio was known for his humility and strong sense of ethics. Despite being one of the most physically impressive men the sport had ever seen, he never acted like an untouchable star. Instead, he treated everyone with respect and carried himself like an ordinary man, something that only increased the admiration people had for him. His legacy also lived on through his family. Sergio was the father of Sergio Oliva Jr., who chose to follow in his father's footsteps as a professional bodybuilder. With his own style and competing in a completely different era, the Oliva name returned to the stage, keeping that legendary past alive. Even after years of intense rivalries and heated battles, Sergio continued to earn the respect of former opponents. Very few athletes ever managed to create such a powerful visual and psychological impact on the sport. In 2012, Sergio Oliva passed away due to kidney-related complications, bringing an end to a life marked by triumphs, conflicts, and resilience. Among the many tributes, one of the most meaningful came from Arnold Schwarzenegger, who acknowledged Sergio not just as a historic rival, but as a true friend and a one-of-a-kind legend.